Hello, it's Christine with Left Side Art, and today I am going to show you how I created an art journal page in my new Dilutions Creative Journal. This is about 9 by 12 and it comes with a folder in the front cover here and about 64 pages that are unlined, and it's very thick media paper. There is no pound on here, so I don't know what the actual number is, but I have layered and layered a lot of inks and water on this page and it did not bleed through at all. It also comes with a little strap that you can use to close it, and the cover is kind of like a really hard cardstock type of material that later I went back and designed mine. These pages are bound together with string down the crease, so you do have to be a little careful you don't put too much liquid or it could possibly bleed through to the next set of pages, but you'll have that in almost any journal. So we are going to take the first step, which is creating a background. This is the first of 3 major steps we're going to go through on how to create a very simple art journal layout. You can also do this exact same set of techniques on a canvas board or a canvas. You don't have to work in an art journal if you don't want to. Okay, what I'm going to do here is use some Liquitex Basics gesso, and I first was just going to coat the pages to get rid of this manila look, but then I decided to use Tim Holtz tissue paper. Gesso is not the best when it comes to using it as a glue. It's more of a cover for paper or to recolor certain embellishments. It adds a layer on top of whatever you're working on, and it just makes it so it's less porous, it absorbs less of your materials. In any case, it is not, at least this Liquitex Basics is not sticky enough to be used as a glue, and I ended up going back and layering some gel medium underneath my tissue paper to get it to stick. So after I did this to both sides, lay down this tissue paper. This is Postal by Tim Holtz, and it just has some really nice writing in here and images, but it was a little too bold for what I wanted in my background. I wanted to push this back a bit, so I added a layer of the same gesso on top, and I mixed this in with a little bit of a damp brush, or you can spritz water directly onto your pages here just to get the gesso to thin out a little bit, and it's not like painting white paint on top of your page here. This gesso also is a little gritty feeling, and I actually don't mind that at all. I kind of prefer it just to add some texture, literally texture, to your pages, but there are other brands that are a bit smoother if you prefer that feel to it. And this is also opaque, so that's why I water it down a bit. You could get semi-opaque or more transparent gessos on the market as well. The Liquitex Basics, I also paint large paintings, and this is artist quality. I use a lot of it, so this is why I have such a large container. You can buy a lot smaller containers by other companies to use in your art journals as well. And beware, it will ruin your brush if you don't clean it properly. My brush here is quite damaged. I've also started using some other tools in lieu of paint brushes to get layers of gesso or gel medium onto my pages. After this first layer dried, I went back and layered some more gesso on here. I just wanted it a little more vague when it came to looking at these very bold prints. It was just a little too heavy for what I was going for. And to dry it, you could have let it air dry. I used a heat tool that I have. It's actually for embossing, or you can use a hair dryer, just whatever you have handy. If not, let it air dry. To protect the rest of my pages in my art journal, and also the cover, because this one has a folder in the front, I layered magazine scraps underneath each of my pages. And now what I'm doing is I'm going around just cutting off the excess, because I want to start painting my pages and adding some color to them, and I want to be able to see where the border is. These markers I'm going to use are by Faber-Castell, and they are the Pitt Artist Pen Big Brushes. These are really nice. The only one I've had to replace so far is the black because I use it so much, but otherwise these should last you a pretty long time. The three colors I want to use for my background are Deep Scarlet Red 219, Scarlet Red 118, and Orange Glaze 113. You can get these markers with fine tips and bullet nibs and things like that, possibly even chisel, but these brush ones are just, I think, a lot easier to use. I've used a baby wipe to kind of smooth them out a little bit and move the ink around. This is India ink, so after it's dry it will be permanent, but before it dries, and especially because we use the gesso, you can move it around a little bit with a little bit of water. So either a damp baby wipe, or in this case I've also used just a little bit of water on my finger to move the ink around. You can also use a paintbrush that's dampened a bit too. And this India ink is nice because you can layer it and layer it until you get the desired effect that you're looking for. I usually like to put a border around my page, even if it is just a little bit of a darker color, like what I'm doing here. This is brown that I'm using. That is Nougat number 178. I also like to use just a little bit of black sometimes, or I could have used the darker red, the Deep Scarlet Red here for a border as well, if you don't like that a bit more vintagey look that I'm going for. I also sometimes use grays. Warm Gray 4 number 273 is also another favorite. Now, because I added this tissue paper with gel medium and gesso and got it all glued down, it naturally has some ridges throughout it, and so I use that to my advantage of where I am adding some of this darker distressed color. I just went across where there was any natural raises in the tissue paper. And I'm naturally getting some more texture on these pages because of that gesso that I said I was already so gritty. Whenever you rub some color on top of it, you can really start to see how much texture really is in this gesso. And don't be afraid to mess up. I mean, this is just an art journal page. It's meant to, you know, just be fun. And if you add a little bit of color in certain places and you didn't like it, you can always cover it up with another embellishment or tear out another piece of tissue paper and kind of start over in that one section. But I say just go for it, keep going until the end. People always say you go through an ugly stage when you're working on anything artistic, and by the time you get done, it hopefully ends up looking a lot better than you had imagined. But in any case, I am finding stencils that I want to use. This is a pack of paper stencils. I didn't realize that when I had first bought it, but I guess that's why it was so cheap. These end up working out well in any regard. I don't really see too much of a difference between these and the plastic ones, other than, of course, don't soak these in water to clean them. But they have held up pretty well. I've used them quite a bit. There's multiple different packages you can get, and there are so many within the package that, you know, if you don't end up not liking one or two of them, you're really not losing any money on it. And this little dauber I'm using, I'm dipping it into black archival ink. And archival just means that once it's dry, it's not moving. It's going to be there for a very long time. And I'm using a little finger dauber to get into these fine stencil areas. You could also have used a distress blender by Tim Holtz, or you know, some other things, but these little daubers work pretty well. And I like to add these, anything I'm adding, but in particular these stencils, whatever pattern I pick, I usually pick at least 2, sometimes 3, but never just one. And I like to add it somewhat randomly throughout my page, but also trying to keep things balanced. So the bottom left-hand corner and the top right-hand corner are opposite each other, and this is where, you know, just trying to make the page a bit more balanced. And also not forgetting about that center fold. When you're working in art journals, you naturally have a fold where the page is. Sometimes you have to plan around that, especially the way that your book is going to close. But if you're doing this on a canvas board, you know, it might be a little bit easier starting out, so you don't have to plan around a crease. These stamps are probably my favorite, especially the script down here at the bottom. This is by Stampers Anonymous, Tim Holtz. And I just did this a little bit into my black archival ink and put it randomly. This tissue paper already had a lot of text in it, but I just felt like it needed a little bit more to it, and this is one of my favorite ones, so why not? You could have used an acrylic block to hold your stamp, but I usually like just to use those cling stamps as much as I can with my fingers, because in art journals, you're usually working on somewhat of a lumpy surface. Now this book of animals, I'll have the link to this book in the description below. I got at a craft store, but they also sell it on Amazon. And I really like these images, but I honestly do not have enough patience to color in each of these tiny little Zentangle areas. So what I planned on doing was just this, of cutting it out and placing it within an art journal. I thought it was a nice size. It's already really nice. And if you don't have, you know, these type of coloring books, you could also cut out an image from Google or Pixabay, where in Pixabay they actually have a lot of license-free, royalty-free images that you can use, and you don't have to worry about using something that you're going to get in trouble with later. But this is my focal point, which brings us to step 2. What is your main image? Is it a set of images? Is it just one? In this case, obviously, I'm really just going for one main image, and I'm going to have it off to the one side of my book. You can also cut out images from magazines and older books maybe that you're not going to use anymore and things like that. So now I'm just trying to figure out what colors I want to do, and I definitely want to incorporate my background into my main image, and there's a couple of different ways you can do that. In this journal page, I really repeat the 3 markers that I used in my background onto my image. Here, before I start that, I'm just adding some of this black archival around my border. I just thought it needed to darken just a little bit more. Now this gel medium I'm using is by TriArt. Again, it's kind of industrial sized. It's a lot bigger than what you might want to get for yourself, but I use this with my artist quality paints and paintings that I do on canvases. And this one container lasted me almost 2 years. You do have to be careful closing the lid rather tightly and keeping the lid rim clear of glue, or otherwise, yeah, this container's been glued shut a couple times and it's really hard to get it back open. This gel medium, when I use it in paintings, it really helps my paints, because I use acrylic paint a lot, it helps keep my paint moving. But it's also really sticky, and since it's artist quality, I don't have to worry about quality issues of gluing this down. I use it on the back of my image, and I also use it on the front of my image. The reason why is because this is paper. This box came out of a coloring book, and it's nothing special. It's just plain old paper that they used. And in order to layer paints or these markers on top of it without the paper soaking up the liquid so quickly, I use the gel medium on top of the image, and it helps this type of India ink and such move around on the image a lot easier. You could experiment with this. Try using this India ink on a piece of paper without any gesso or gel medium and see how much it moves or how much it doesn't move, and then use the same marker on top of gessoed or gel medium surface, and you'll notice a huge difference. So this black India ink, I ended up taking a small paintbrush just to make sure I could get into some of the details. I dampened this paintbrush just a very, very small amount, just so that I can move around the ink a bit more. You could have also used just a regular permanent black ink pen too, or the microns and such to get the same look, but I wanted to be able to feather this out just a little bit in some areas. Now I'm taking the same brown that I used around my border for some of the shadows on the fox, and I also had to use that same brown around my image to make it look like it's just a little more attached to my background and not just something that was simply cut out and pasted on top of a background. Getting your focal point in a way that it looks like it was incorporated into the background can sometimes be a little bit challenging, but just by using the same colors or the same stencils or the same whatever as you did in your background on your focal image, this is where this becomes a lot easier. You really don't have to think too much about it. You just get in there, do it, and it automatically be incorporated. So now I'm just taking the same colors as 3 oranges that I used in my background, and I'm applying them a bit thicker, a bit more opaque, and not really using as much liquid to thin them out like I did in the background. So even though it's the same colors, you know, the background gives a lot more of a faded effect, where on the fox, you know, I want it to be a bit more bold. And this doesn't stain your hands too much, but if you're worried about that, instead of using your finger, just use a baby wipe that isn't fresh out of the bag, but maybe it's been sitting out for a little bit and it's a little more dried out, because otherwise you end up with the same effect you have in the background where it's just a really watered down look. Now if you're not too sure where the colors go on a fox like this, just pull it up on Google, a simple search of fox, and you'll be able to see where the colors are in their faces versus where the white fur is, and get a little bit better of an idea of what you're doing. Just a little bit of that warm gray I was referring to earlier. I wanted to try to get a little bit of shadow in on the fox's face. This is kind of where all that white fur would be, but I didn't want to leave it just a pure white. I want to be able to give him some dimension. And if this turned out in a way I didn't like, the only thing I would have to do is, you know, maybe add a little bit of white paint on top of it for some highlights here and there. The Zentangle that they have, the artist already created within this fox, I think gives it a lot of really nice detail that I otherwise would not have added myself. But if you like to do that type of thing, you can definitely draw out your own image on a separate piece of paper, cut it out and put it on here and get the similar effect. And it's always easier to start lighter and then go darker. So what you see me doing here is I started out with just barely any of the gray on the fox's white fur and some of the shadows, and slowly building this back up. As one area dries, I start to work on the next area. Because otherwise you're just going to continually move around ink and you won't get the depth that you want to accomplish. I'm also adding some of the same gray to the shadows around the fox. And with this India ink, it's always easier to go from lighter to darker than it is darker to lighter. There is a white India ink big pip brush pen that I do have, and it is very opaque and I like it a lot. It's just if I use it here too much, I'll be covering up a lot of that Zentangle that I do want to have shown through. I did just use a baby wipe to wipe off a little bit where I put too much gray, and you can do that only because it's still wet for just a few seconds after you apply it. And this is where I started adding a little bit more of that same color to the background to balance it out a little bit. I thought my background looked a little too pink, the way that the deep scarlet red was in the background, so I went through with this orange color, which is Orange Glaze number 113, and just added it and balanced it out throughout my background a bit better. I think it's easier to complete your background first and then add an image, where I've seen other people want to draw straight on their page and then they work a background around their image. I think that's a lot harder to do, and it definitely takes a lot more patience and more time and possibly even more planning. In this case, you know, maybe drawing a fox straight on my background when it came out so cleanly, but you know, I had planned on cutting an image out and putting it on top of my background anyway, that I prefer doing background first and then working on my focal point. So now I'm using some light permanent blue paint by Liquitex Basics. Again, this is my artist quality paints that I use. You can very easily use craft paint too. These are archival and light fast, and it just makes it so much more dependable as a paint whenever you're using it on paintings that are going to be hung on the wall, and a lot of sunlight or whatever is going to be hitting it. But in an art journal where you're just going to be closing it up at the end of the day, and maybe popping it open every once in a while, you can definitely use some craft paint, which on my later pages, that's exactly what I switched to. In the meantime, I just really like this blue in particular, as it balanced out the orange. And if you look at a color wheel, blue and orange are opposite each other, which means that if you mix them together directly, you'll end up with like a muddy brown color. And if that's what you're going for, then great. But if not, you want your piece to look more balanced, using complementary colors, which are colors opposite each other on the color wheel, is a neat way of getting your image or your piece feeling a little bit more balanced. And I think it gives it a little more interest just to add something like that in here, rather than this piece. If it was just all oranges and browns, I just think it was looking a little dull, a little boring. So I want to give it a little bit of pop of color, and this light blue by Liquitex Basics was, I think, the perfect complement to this layout. I'm using it as a little bit of a highlighter throughout the fox, and just adding it as if it was, part of the fox's color naturally. And I also had splattered some of this paint throughout my background on both sides of my layout here, just so that it felt a bit more incorporated. And I didn't really care if some of those splatters landed on top of the fox. I think it just helps incorporate the fox into the background that much more. And just like I did with the India inks, starting lighter and adding more and more on top of it is a better way to go in certain cases, so that if you do add a little too much, you don't have to worry about trying to undo it. Adding layers on top of each other also gives it more depth in the end. This is my Posca paint pen in white, and it's just a nice little bullet nib, and it added some pretty white opaque dots on top of the eyes and such. You could have used regular paint or even a little bit of gesso too, but that Posca paint pen works pretty well. Just remember to clean up the nib if you happen to get any India ink or paint on it. What I'm doing here is adding some heavy black gesso by Art Basics. This gesso dries very matte, and I think it adds a nice added touch to my background. I'm doing this with a Tim Holtz stencil. I think this is called Splatter, but it has like some coffee mug stains on it and stuff, and it's pretty versatile stencil that I like to use various parts of it for my backgrounds. I am applying the gesso through the stencil with a applicator. This applicator kind of has like this rubbery tip to it. It's not really like a sponge, but it's definitely not a brush. And this applicator, you can wipe it off pretty easily with a wet baby wipe, or dip it in some water and wipe it off with a paper towel. The size of this applicator is a number 1, and it's by Art Basics Finnabair. I'll have a link to it in the description below as well. You could have also used a brush or an old credit card or whatever to apply this black gesso, but this is, like I said, pretty easy to clean, and it was definitely worth the investment in my opinion. And just with everything else I did in my background, I try to keep this pretty evenly distributed throughout my background, so that no one side is heavier than the other, but it's not just random and everywhere either. So put some thought behind, where you might add your heavier blobs versus the smaller splatters, in any of the aspects you might be adding to your background. I also took some of this black matte gesso and added it to the nose as well. I don't mind that my background layered on top of my image. I actually did that on purpose, again, to tie it together. This punch was given to me to hang on to by a friend, and I decided to utilize it. And I just punched out a couple of foxes with heavy black cardstock. I didn't know how many I was going to use or what I really wanted to do with them, but I thought they would make a nice addition to my background. I also wasn't too sure if I want to use the negative space and use it potentially as like a stencil, or just apply it directly to my background, or if I really did want the actual punch. After I cut all this out, and later I did not end up using this, I just kept it in case I want to use it later. I don't have to go back through and fussy cut. I'm not a huge fan of fussy cutting. Now these little chipboards are going to help me create my message, which brings us to our third and final step in making an art journal page or a mixed media background, however you want to look at it. These are by Tim Holtz. I don't have the original packaging, or at least not all of it, so I can't tell you what it was called, but to my knowledge, this is the only one that he has that are on large white pieces of chipboard like this. And I just keep going through all the ones I have left, because this is an open box I've used before on other projects, and just trying to figure something out that would make sense for my background. I usually have an idea of what message or word I might want to use in my background, but sometimes I also just like to look around and make sure I don't want to change my mind and use something else. But there are a lot of really good options through this little set. So he also has sticker page books and things like that with either words or little phrases that come smaller, and either on white or a craft paper type of color, or black with white font. So you have other options, or you can always just write your own word, or use a stamp set with letters and stamp out a word or a message. In this case, you can see there are a lot of really good options. Some of these I actually saved for my very next projects. For this background, I am going with Seek and Wander. I thought that would make a really good addition to the foxes that I have, and because this was the first art journal layout that I had within this Dilutions book here, I figured it would be a good message for when you first open it up, that, you know, basically possibilities are endless, and, you know, continue to seek and wonder until you're happy. This also played into the Tim Holtz tissue paper that I used in the very beginning for my background, that had a travel theme to it with all the postage marks and things like that. I added a little wood veneer airplane at the top right hand corner there, and another one on top of the fox's ear. I applied the black cardstock fox cutout with gel medium to my page, and with anything that's heavier and thicker, I like to use Eileen's tacky glue. It doesn't dry right away. You actually have a lot of time to keep moving things around until it does dry, but it's really good glue for after it does dry. It also dries clear, so even if you might have a few white blobs like I'm cleaning up here, you don't have to worry about it too much. I also try not to use too heavy of items in these pages. Be different if I was working on a mixed media board or a canvas board. This gold I'm using here is by Dr. P.H. Martin. It's actually a calligraphy gold, and it is called Iridescent 11R Copper Plate Gold. Again, I'll have links below. This bottle, it's really nice. It comes with a dropper inside of it, and it does settle. The contents inside the bottle do settle, so you have to shake it for a good couple of minutes before you use it. You might get a little air bubble here and there, but just by using on a palette like I am here and a paintbrush, it doesn't really matter. Just I guess air bubbles might affect you if you're using it for a calligraphy pen, but in this case, it works just fine. Shake it up, put some out on your palette, and I use a paintbrush to kind of paint in where I might want this gold here and there. I just felt like my entire background and image was just a little too matte, a little too muted, and I just want a little pop of shimmer, and this gold ended up working out perfectly. So I just add a little bit here and there around my fox, and then throughout my background, again tying everything together. It's a key aspect for whenever you're creating a page like this. You want some interest, you want some focals, but you also want it to look like it all belongs. I went back to my big Pitt brush pen with archival ink in it. This is just the black, and I use a paintbrush to get some straighter lines through here, and also a paintbrush helps you get really close to your edges here, like around this fox and around the words, where if I try blurring it out with my finger just can't fit along those edges so cleanly. So a flat brush like this works out really well, and this is dampened. Otherwise, the ink wouldn't move quite so easily. I'm just going back through and adding a little bit more depth to areas here and there. I just like there to be a bit more contrast, and it helps your image pop a bit better if you have some dark shadows and some bright highlights and such. I usually stick to a few specific things I like to do in my pages or my mixed media boards, whether it's using similar stencils or similar materials. But another thing I like to do is add vertical lines coming down my page sometimes. In this case, I tried it and just didn't really feel like it fit very well, so I blended it out. I mean, it looked like it was just part of the stressed look I was going for in the background. So again, just play around with whatever you want to do in here. You know, if you do something you don't like, cover it up. But otherwise, just keep going along with whatever you have put down and keep working at it. And I think you'll eventually get to a point where you realize when you're done. Sometimes I struggle with that as well. I wish sometimes there was an undo button when it came to art journal page layouts, because sometimes I go a little too far with some things, but it's all in good fun. Now I took the same light blue permanent color from Liquitex Basics that I had used on the larger fox face, and I wanted to try to create a little bit of interest around this black fox. I felt like he was just too flat black, and he did look like he was literally just cut out and pasted on top of my background. Now the nice thing about this blue and the black, the way they work together is that a lot of times, you know, blue will be kind of the color for a shadow of a black item. Let's say if you're watching, you know, a cartoon and a character has black hair, to make it look like it has some shadow to it, the artist will add a little bit of blue. So this ended up working out pretty well, and I also used it around my words and such, again just tying everything together. Some people might have called it done you know, earlier than this, and that's fine. It's all personal preference. And this is Liquitex Basics white that I'm using. This white is pretty opaque. Again, this is artist quality paint. You do not need to use something like this. Just use regular craft paint, or with white, it's nice because you use an opaque gesso to get the effect you're looking for. And this is where I just try creating some splashes throughout my background. I had already done the blue splashes, and I just felt like a little bit of white going throughout the background, especially with the black gesso that I had used with the stencil. Kind of looked like it was heavier splashes. I just want to put some white through there. Again, I do not mind whatsoever. This goes on top of my images. I'm actually aiming to do just that, and it just kind of helps tie everything together. White, of course, is also an excellent highlighter. So I just took a very fine paintbrush and added a little bit more lines to my fox, and what this does is it creates a little bit more dimension so he doesn't look like he's so flat. Adding a little bit of highlight here and there, and that way it looks like he's looking up and over to the larger fox, or possibly the word wander is a cliff he's standing on. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret this, but I just want to give him a little more dimension, make him look a little more 3D, a little more like he belonged. This is just a stamp with dates on it, And sometimes I stamp myself, sometimes I don't, but in this case I went ahead and did so. I provide these layouts on my website as free downloads for either your computer, tablet, or phone backgrounds, or I sell the prints of these without the month and date on my ArtPal account. If you'd like to share what you created, please hashtag your work at hashtag HeyLeftSideArt. Also, you can hashtag LeftSideArtCritique if you would like me to critique your work next month. Thank you, and I will catch you next time.